Right now, you're probably lying in bed with your phone or tablet, listening to this video in a room with electric lights, climate control, maybe a door that locks. You're surrounded by thousands of years of accumulated human knowledge. Language, writing, agriculture, mathematics, medicine. All of it built on the foundation of civilization. But here's something that should keep you up at night, or actually help you fall asleep while your mind quietly spirals. For 200,000 years before any of this existed, anatomically modern humans just like you, with brains just as large and complex as yours, were walking around Earth doing what exactly? That's the question that haunts archaeologists and anthropologists. It's a mystery so profound that most people don't even realize it exists. We call it humanity's dark age, but that name doesn't do it justice. This wasn't a few centuries of lost knowledge like the period after Rome fell. This was 200,000 years. 200,000 years of modern humans leaving almost no trace, building nothing permanent, creating no cities, no agriculture, no written language, nothing that we would recognize as civilization. Think about that timeline for a second. Homo sapiens, people who looked exactly like us, appeared around 300,000 years ago in Africa. By 200,000 years ago, we were fully modern. Same brain size, same cognitive abilities, same capacity for language and abstract thought. And then, nothing. For the next 190,000 years, almost nothing happens. No pyramids, no temples, no cities, no bronze, no iron, no wheel, no domesticated animals except dogs. Just small groups of humans wandering, hunting, gathering and disappearing into the archaeological void. The first real civilizations don't show up until around 10,000 years ago. That's it. All of recorded history, everything you learned in school, every pharaoh and emperor and kingdom and war, all of it happened in the last 5,000 years. Which means we spent 97% of our existence as modern humans doing something completely different. Something we've almost entirely forgotten. If you're using this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. Maybe hit subscribe and tell me where you are and what time it is right now. I love checking comments and seeing Seoul at sunrise, Seattle at midnight, Sydney at lunch, all watching at once, all wondering the same thing. What were we doing for all those lost millennia? See, this isn't just an academic curiosity. This is personal. Those people living 100,000 years ago weren't some primitive proto-humans. They were us. They had the same emotional capacity you do. They fell in love, they grieved their dead, they looked at the stars and wondered what they were. They created art. We know this because we found cave paintings dating back 45,000 years, maybe older. They made jewelry. They buried their dead with ceremony. They had culture and language and music. They were fully human in every sense that matters. But they didn't build civilizations. For 200,000 years they didn't farm, didn't settle down, didn't create anything that would last. Why not? What was stopping them? Was it the environment, the climate? Were they missing some crucial piece of knowledge, some technological breakthrough that wouldn't come for another 190,000 years? Or is there something else, something we're missing entirely? Recent discoveries are challenging everything we thought we knew about this dark age. Archaeological sites that shouldn't exist. Evidence of sophisticated technologies appearing and disappearing without explanation. Ancient structures that predate the supposed beginning of civilization by thousands of years. Genetic evidence suggesting populations' bottlenecks, migrations and mixing events we never suspected. Mathematical analysis of ancient astronomical alignments that imply knowledge we thought impossible for prehistoric people. The story you were taught in school goes like this. Humans evolved, spent a long time as simple hunter-gatherers, then about 10,000 years ago figured out farming, settled down, and boom, civilization. Nice, clean, linear progression. Except the more we dig, literally and figuratively, the more that story falls apart. The truth is vastly more complex, more mysterious, and honestly more unsettling. What were our ancestors doing during those 200,000 years? How sophisticated were they really? What knowledge did they possess that left no trace? And most importantly, what happened to it all? Why did humanity spend so long in the shadows before suddenly, explosively, rising to dominate the entire planet? These are the questions we're going to explore. Not with easy answers or comfortable certainties, but with the evidence, the mysteries, and the shocking gaps in what we know. Because understanding humanity's dark age isn't just about the past, it's about understanding what we are, what we're capable of, and what we might become. It's about recognizing that our current civilization, as permanent as it feels, is just the latest chapter in a story that's been running for 300,000 years, and for most of that time the pages have been blank. So let's turn back the clock, way back before writing, before cities, before everything you think of as human history, back to the lost millennia when we were already human but not yet civilized, back to the dark age before humanity rose. Here's where the story gets complicated. Because if you ask an anthropologist when modern humans first appeared, you'll get an answer that seems straightforward. Homo sapiens emerged around 300,000 years ago in Africa. We've got the fossils to prove it. Skulls with high foreheads, reduced brow ridges, gracile bone structure. All the anatomical features that define our species. Case closed, right? Except it's not that simple, not even close. Because having a modern human body doesn't mean you have a modern human mind. And this is where things get really weird. For roughly 230,000 years, anatomically modern humans walked around Africa doing basically the same things their ancestors had been doing for millions of years. Making simple stone tools, hunting and gathering using techniques that wouldn't look out of place 500,000 years earlier. Living in small groups with limited technology and no particular indication they were anything special. They had the hardware, the big brains, the vocal apparatus capable of complex speech, the manual dexterity to create sophisticated tools. But something was missing. The software, if you will. The cognitive operating system that would eventually allow humans to create art, build civilizations, develop agriculture, invent writing. All the stuff that makes us recognizably human wasn't there yet. Anthropologists call this the problem of behavioral modernity, and it's one of the biggest mysteries in human evolution. When did we actually become us? Not just anatomically, but mentally. When did human consciousness as we know it actually emerge? The traditional answer points to around 70,000 years ago. This is when the archaeological record suddenly explodes with evidence of modern human behavior. Sophisticated tools made from bone and antler, not just stone. Shell beads and personal ornaments indicating a sense of self-identity. Cave paintings and engraved patterns showing symbolic thinking. Long-distance trade networks moving raw materials hundreds of miles. Specialized hunting techniques targeting specific prey species. Evidence of planning, abstract reasoning, artistic expression. All the stuff that screams modern human suddenly appears in the fossil record like someone flipped a switch. Scholars call this the cognitive revolution, and the question that's haunted anthropology for decades is simple. What the hell happened? How does a species go from 230,000 years of basically nothing to suddenly inventing art, symbolism, and complex culture almost overnight in evolutionary terms. Some researchers think it was genetic. Maybe a random mutation occurred around 70,000 years ago that rewired the human brain, enabling new forms of thinking. Perhaps something about neural connectivity changed, allowing different parts of the brain to communicate in novel ways. This could have enabled the complex associations necessary for symbolic thinking, the ability to let one thing represent another thing, which is the foundation of language, art, and abstract reasoning. Others argue it was cultural, that the capacity for modern thinking had been there all along, but it took time for the right social conditions to emerge. Maybe once human populations reached a certain density, once trade networks became established, once knowledge-sharing systems developed, that's when the cognitive revolution happened. Not because individual brains changed, but because the collective intelligence of interconnected groups reached a critical threshold. But here's what the archaeological evidence actually shows, and it's weirder than either explanation suggests. Modern human behavior didn't just suddenly appear 70,000 years ago. It flickered on and off for tens of thousands of years before that. In South Africa, at a site called Blombos Cave, archaeologists found engraved ochre pieces decorated with abstract geometric patterns. They're 100,000 years old. Someone was making art, creating symbols, engaging in abstract thinking 30,000 years before the supposed cognitive revolution. In the same cave, they found shell beads carefully perforated for stringing into jewellery, personal ornaments indicating self-awareness and social identity. 75,000 years old. At Pinnacle Point, also in South Africa, researchers discovered evidence of systematic heat treatment of stone to improve its flaking quality. This isn't just banging rocks together. This is understanding that if you carefully heat certain types of stone to specific temperatures, you can change their material properties, making them easier to work. That's chemistry, folks. Applied materials science. 165,000 years ago. So the cognitive revolution wasn't really a revolution at all. It was more like a stuttering start. Modern human behavior appears in the archaeological record, persists for a while, then disappears, only to show up again thousands of years later, sometimes in different locations, sometimes with slightly different innovations. It's like watching someone try to start a fire in wet conditions. Little sparks of modernity that flicker, catch briefly, then go out, over and over, for more than 100,000 years. Why? What was preventing these innovations from taking hold? Why did groups capable of making jewelry and creating art and developing advanced hunting techniques apparently abandon these behaviors, reverting to more primitive life ways? The answer, as usual, comes down to climate and disaster. Around 74,000 years ago, something happened that almost ended humanity entirely. Mount Toba, a supervolcano in Indonesia, exploded with a force that makes modern volcanic eruptions look like firecrackers. This was the most powerful volcanic event in the last 2 million years. A Category 8 eruption, the highest classification on the Volcanic Explosivity Index. The explosion ejected approximately 2,800 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. That's enough to bury the entire United States under 0.5 meter of volcanic debris. But the immediate blast wasn't the real problem. The real problem was what came after. All that volcanic material shot into the stratosphere created a sulfur dioxide cloud that circled the planet. It blocked sunlight, dropped global temperatures by possibly 15 degrees Celsius in some regions, and triggered what's known as a volcanic winter that lasted years, maybe decades. Plant life died. Herbivores starved, predators disappeared, and humans, who were probably already struggling with climate fluctuations from the ongoing ice age, suddenly found themselves facing a catastrophe that makes anything in recorded history look trivial. The genetic evidence for this near-extinction event is written in our DNA. When scientists analyze the genetic diversity of modern humans and compare it to other species, something stands out immediately. We have remarkably low genetic diversity for a species that's spread across the entire planet. Chimpanzees, who live in a fraction of the territory humans occupy, have more genetic variation than we do, way more. The explanation is a population bottleneck. Sometime in the relatively recent past, human population numbers crashed so hard that we almost went extinct. Most estimates put the number of breeding individuals at somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000. That's it. That's how many humans were alive during the worst of it. Maybe as few as 1,000 breeding pairs scattered across Africa and possibly parts of Asia. Many researchers think the Toba eruption was the cause. The timing fits, the genetic evidence fits, the climate data fits. For possibly 1,000 years, maybe more, humans clung to survival in isolated refugia, small pockets where conditions were marginally less catastrophic, river valleys that maintained some vegetation, coastal areas where seafood remained available, highland regions where altitude provided some protection from the worst effects. The archaeological record from this period becomes vanishingly thin. There are sites, but they're few and far between, showing small groups using simple technologies, probably just trying to survive day to day with no resources left over for art or innovation or cultural development. All those flickering signs of behavioral modernity that had appeared in the earlier periods, gone. Survival mode doesn't leave time for painting caves or making jewelry. But humans didn't go extinct. Somehow those small scattered populations held on. They adapted to the harsh conditions. They developed survival strategies that worked even when almost everything else was dying. And they maintained just enough genetic diversity, just enough connection between groups to survive as a species. Then, slowly, the volcanic winter ended. Temperatures began to rise, plants returned, animal populations recovered, and humanity, forged by the most extreme selection pressure imaginable, began to expand again. But here's the thing. The people who emerged from this bottleneck weren't the same as those who entered it. Thousands of years of intense natural selection had refined human populations for intelligence, cooperation, and adaptability. Only the smartest, most resourceful, most socially coordinated groups survived. The genes for those traits became concentrated in the surviving population. This is probably when behavioral modernity actually became permanent, not because of a single mutation or a simple cultural change, but because the population bottleneck had fundamentally altered human evolution. The survivors weren't just anatomically modern humans. They were cognitively modern humans, selected over thousands of generations for exactly the mental traits that define our species today. Around 70,000 years ago, when the archaeological record shows that sudden explosion of modern behavior, that's not when it began. That's when the survivors of Toba finally had populations large enough, territories stable enough, and resources sufficient enough to start expressing the cognitive abilities that had been selected for during the crisis. The cognitive revolution wasn't evolution happening. It was evolution revealing itself. The mental toolkit had already been built during those desperate millennia of near extinction. Now, with conditions improving, humans finally had the chance to use it. But the crisis wasn't entirely over. because even as human populations began to recover and expand, the world they inhabited remained hostile. The ice age that had been ongoing for tens of thousands of years continued. Glaciers covered much of Europe and Asia. Sea levels were hundreds of feet lower than today, exposing land bridges between continents, but also creating vast stretches of cold, dry terrain. These glacial periods shaped everything about human evolution. They determined where people could live, how they could migrate, and most importantly, they isolated populations from each other for extended periods. Groups that had once been connected found themselves separated by expanding ice sheets or newly formed deserts. They adapted to their local conditions, developing specialized survival strategies for their particular environments. In Africa, some populations stayed near the coasts, developing sophisticated seafood harvesting techniques. Others moved into interior regions, becoming specialized hunters of large game. Each group refined their tools and technologies for their specific ecological niche. This isolation created another mystery. Why did different groups seem to independently develop similar innovations, only to lose them again? At various sites across Africa, archaeologists find evidence of advanced behaviors appearing, disappearing, then reappearing later, sometimes in the same location, sometimes hundreds of miles away. Symbolic artifacts, advanced tools, complex hunting strategies. They show up, persist for a few thousand years, then vanish from the archaeological record, only to reappear millennia later. The explanation is probably demographic. Small populations are vulnerable to what anthropologists call cultural loss. If the one person who knows how to make the best spear points dies before fully teaching someone else, that knowledge can disappear. If a group gets hit by disease or drought and population numbers crash, complex technologies that require many people working together become impossible to maintain. The knowledge doesn't get lost because people forget. It gets lost because there aren't enough people left to practice it, to teach it, to keep the tradition alive. This happened over and over during the Long Ice Age. Groups would develop innovations, populations would grow, culture would flourish. Then some local disaster, drought, disease, conflict with neighbors would strike. Population numbers would crash. The complex technologies would be abandoned because the group was too small to maintain them. Survivors would revert to simpler, more reliable tools and techniques. Then, over generations, as populations recovered, someone would reinvent the lost technologies or learn them from neighboring groups. This is why the archaeological record looks so weird for this period. It's not that humans were stupid, or that behavioral modernity kept switching on and off. It's that small populations living in marginal environments are incredibly vulnerable to cultural loss. Innovation requires population density, resource surplus, and social stability. When any of those factors disappear, even temporarily, cultural complexity can collapse rapidly. The miracle isn't that complex behaviors sometimes disappeared. The miracle is that they kept coming back, that humans kept reinventing, rediscovering, relearning, that the cognitive capacity for innovation survived even when the innovations themselves didn't. Generation after generation, adapting, surviving, and maintaining the potential for complexity even when circumstances didn't allow its full expression. This was humanity's true dark age, not before we were modern, but during the long millennia when we were modern but couldn't fully express it. When we had the cognitive abilities but not the population numbers, not the resource stability, not the social networks to build lasting cultural complexity. For 60,000 years after the Toba bottleneck, this pattern continued. flickers of brilliance followed by regression, innovation followed by loss. Humans were modern, but their modernity remained fragile, dependent on circumstances that were constantly shifting with climate fluctuations and local disasters, until something finally changed, and when it did, it changed everything. But that's the next chapter of the story. Here's something nobody tells you about our hunter-gatherer ancestors. They weren't primitive. They weren't simple. They weren't just wandering around hitting things with sticks and hoping to stumble across dinner. For over 200,000 years, anatomically modern humans lived as hunter-gatherers, and somewhere along the way, we convinced ourselves that those 200,000 years were basically just a long, boring prologue to the real story of human civilization. Agriculture shows up 12,000 years ago, and suddenly that's when history actually begins. Everything before? Just waiting, just survival, just existing. Except that's completely wrong. The archaeological discoveries of the last few decades have shattered that narrative so thoroughly that we need an entirely new way of thinking about our pre-agricultural past. Because what we're finding isn't evidence of primitive simplicity. We're finding complexity, organization, sophistication, cultural achievements that shouldn't exist according to everything we thought we knew about human development. Start with Göbekli Tepe. If you haven't heard of this place, prepare to have your mind restructured. 1995, southeastern Turkey, a shepherd notices some oddly shaped stones on a hilltop. Archaeologists investigate and find something that shouldn't exist. Massive stone pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons, arranged in circular enclosures. Elaborate carvings of animals, abstract symbols, geometric patterns. Engineering that required planning, organization, and hundreds of workers. The kind of monumental architecture that's supposed to require settled agricultural societies with social hierarchies and specialized labor forces. But here's the thing that makes Göbekli Tepe absolutely world-shattering. It was built 11,600 years ago, before agriculture, before permanent settlements, before pottery, before metal tools, before everything we thought was necessary for humans to create monumental architecture. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were hunter-gatherers, mobile foragers who supposedly spent all their time just trying to find enough calories to survive. Yet somehow they quarried, carved, transported, and erected stones that weigh more than modern cars. They created artistic masterpieces that demonstrate sophisticated symbolic thinking. And they maintained this building project for over 1,000 years, generation after generation returning to the same sacred site to add new structures and maintain old ones. This isn't supposed to be possible. The entire evolutionary model of human civilization says you need agriculture first. Surplus food production allows population growth. Population growth requires social organization. Social organization enables specialization. And specialization finally makes big building projects possible. Göbekli Tepe does it backward, and it's not alone. Archaeologists are now finding evidence of similar structures across the Middle East and beyond, all predating agriculture. Karahan Tepe, Habetsuvan Tepesi, Bonkuklu Tala, each one revealing the same pattern. Hunter-gatherers coming together to build something monumental, something that served no obvious practical survival purpose. These were ceremonial centers, places of gathering and ritual, evidence that our ancestors weren't just surviving, they were creating meaning. But to build places like this, you need organization, and organization leaves traces. Recent excavations around these megalithic sites have revealed something extraordinary. These weren't just isolated monuments in empty wilderness. They were hubs in vast networks of seasonal gathering, thousands of people converging on specific locations at specific times of the year. Not permanently, not year-round, but in temporary concentrations that functioned like proto-cities. Think about what this requires. You need different groups spread across hundreds of miles to coordinate timing. That means shared calendar systems. You need to bring enough people together that they won't starve while they're there. That means systematic resource management and probably food storage. You need to prevent conflicts between groups who might be traditional rivals. That means social protocols, probably elaborate rituals and ceremonies designed to maintain peace. This is sophisticated social organization. This is complexity at a level we associated only with agricultural civilizations. And the evidence for these seasonal gathering sites is showing up everywhere. In Northern Europe, archaeologists have found concentration points where dozens of hunter-gatherer groups converge during annual fish runs. In North America, sites like Poverty Point in Louisiana show massive earthwork construction by pre-agricultural societies. In Australia, Aboriginal songline routes created networks that connected communities across entire continents. These weren't random wanderings. These were planned migrations following routes that had been established for thousands of years, routes that connected resource nodes, sacred sites, and seasonal gathering points. Routes that required detailed environmental knowledge, astronomical timekeeping, and multi-generational information transmission. Let's talk about that astronomical knowledge because it's wild. Cave paintings in Lascaux, France, 17,000 years old. For decades, archaeologists interpreted them as hunting magic or simple artistic expression. Then someone with astronomy training actually looked at them. Those dots and patterns aren't random, they're star maps, representations of constellations positioned exactly as they would have appeared in the Paleolithic night sky. The Pleiades, Orion, Taurus, all there, documented by people who supposedly didn't have writing, didn't have mathematics, didn't have the cognitive tools for abstract astronomical observation. Except they clearly did. Cave art sites across Europe show similar patterns, not just animals and handprints, but systematic notations that appear to track lunar cycles. 32 dots arranged in crescents, 29 notches carved in sequence. These aren't decoration, they're data recording. Evidence that hunter-gatherers were keeping detailed astronomical records thousands of years before the first agricultural calendars. Why? Because their survival depended on timing, animal migrations, plant flowering cycles, fish spawning runs. Everything operated on schedules dictated by seasonal changes, and those changes were marked by celestial movements. Track the stars and moon accurately enough, and you can predict when and where resources will be available. You can plan gathering schedules. You can coordinate meetings between distant groups. This is science. Systematic observation, data recording, predictive modelling. All happening 15,000 years before Stonehenge, 12,000 years before the first farmers. But maybe the most shocking revelations about hunter-gatherer complexity come from recent discoveries about their trade networks. Obsidian tools found 500 miles from the nearest volcanic source. Seashells discovered in inland sites hundreds of miles from any coast. Amber from the Baltic showing up in Mediterranean sites. These aren't random movements. This is trade. Systematic exchange of goods across vast distances. Recent analysis of European Upper Paleolithic sites has revealed something extraordinary. Materials were moving across trade routes that spanned thousands of miles. Not over decades or centuries, but repeatedly, consistently, over tens of thousands of years. This means established routes, probably specialized traders, definitely complex systems of reciprocal exchange. Think about what this implies. For one group to trade with another group 500 miles away, you need intermediate connections, maybe 10 or 15 groups forming a chain of relationships, each one passing goods to the next. You need trust systems that ensure reciprocity. You need shared standards of value. You need ways to maintain trading relationships across generations. This is economic complexity. Social networks operating at scales that shouldn't exist among small mobile bands of foragers. And it gets even more complex when you look at what they were trading. Not just raw materials like obsidian and shells. Finished goods showing distinctive artistic styles. Tools made using specific techniques characteristic of certain regions. This suggests specialized production. Groups developing expertise in particular crafts and trading their products across continental distances. Some archaeologists now think certain Paleolithic groups were functionally sedentary, staying in resource-rich locations year-round and serving as manufacturing and trading hubs for more mobile populations. It's a complete inversion of what we thought we knew about hunter-gatherer life. But nothing demonstrates the complexity of these ancient societies better than their burial practices. For years, archaeologists dismissed most Paleolithic burials as simple disposal of the dead. Then we started looking more carefully. Sungir, Russia, 34,000 years ago. A burial containing 3 individuals, an adult male and 2 children. They're wearing clothing decorated with over 10,000 ivory beads. The beads alone would have required thousands of hours to manufacture. The adult has a cap decorated with fox teeth. The children have ivory spears and thousands of perforated fox canines arranged in elaborate patterns. This isn't simple burial. This is spectacular wealth display. It's evidence of social hierarchy, specialized labor, and resource accumulation that shouldn't exist among egalitarian hunter-gatherer bands. More discoveries reinforce this pattern. Gravettian burials across Europe, 30,000 to 22,000 years ago, show consistent evidence of social differentiation. Some individuals buried with elaborate grave goods, others with nothing, some interred in prominent locations, others in unmarked graves. We're seeing chiefs, leaders, possibly hereditary aristocracies among people who supposedly lived in simple, equal bands where everyone had the same status. The spiritual beliefs these burials reveal are equally sophisticated. Red ochre staining the bodies and grave goods. Careful positioning of remains, sometimes in fetal positions suggesting rebirth symbolism. Grave goods that clearly indicate belief in an afterlife, a journey the dead needed to prepare for. This is complex religion, developed theology, mythological systems that explain death and what came after. And it required transmission across generations, teaching children elaborate ritual practices and belief systems, maintaining traditions for thousands of years. But perhaps the most powerful evidence of cultural complexity comes from the cave art itself. We've known about cave paintings for over a century, but recent technology is revealing just how sophisticated they really were. Chauvet Cave, France, 36,000 years old. The paintings there don't just show animals, they show movement, perspective, shading techniques that create 3-dimensional effects, multiple limbs suggesting motion, composition that uses the natural contours of cave walls to enhance the illusion of depth. These aren't primitive scratchings. These are masterworks created by artists with highly developed techniques, probably specialists who trained for years to develop their skills, and they're not isolated individual efforts. Analysis of painting techniques across multiple cave sites reveals consistent methods passed down across thousands of years. pigment preparation recipes that remained stable for millennia. Specific tools used the same way across vast geographic areas. This is cultural transmission at scale. Knowledge systems maintaining technical information across hundreds of generations. Some researchers now think the caves functioned as teaching spaces, places where master artists trained apprentices, passing on techniques, symbolic meanings and cultural traditions. The paintings weren't just art, they were textbooks, libraries of knowledge encoded in images that lasted tens of thousands of years. What we're learning from all this evidence is that the primitive, savage narrative was catastrophically wrong. Our hunter-gatherer ancestors weren't simple. They weren't just surviving. They weren't waiting around for some agricultural revolution to finally allow them to develop complex societies. They already had complex societies. They had trade networks, social hierarchies, specialized labor, astronomical knowledge, artistic traditions, religious beliefs, and organizational capabilities that allowed them to coordinate activities across vast regions. So why didn't they develop agriculture earlier? Why did it take 200,000 years of anatomically modern humans before someone decided to start planting seeds? That's the real mystery, because clearly the cognitive capacity was there, the social organization was there, the knowledge transmission systems were there. Everything necessary for civilization existed for millennia before civilization actually appeared. Something was holding them back. Or maybe, just maybe, they weren't being held back at all. Maybe they had something we lost, knowledge we forgot, technologies we can barely imagine. Maybe those 200,000 years weren't waiting for civilization. Maybe they were something else entirely, something we still don't understand. Here's something that should keep you up at night. Everything we think we know about ancient human capabilities is based on what survived. Stone tools, bones, the occasional charcoal smear in a cave. But stone and bone are just the things that don't rot. What about everything else? What about the technologies that were made from wood, plant fibers, animal skins? Things that decompose completely within years or decades. Because when you really think about it, the archaeological record isn't showing us what ancient humans could do. It's showing us the tiny fraction of what they did that happened to be made from materials that last hundreds of thousands of years. Let's start with something that sounds simple but absolutely isn't. Adhesives. We have direct evidence that humans were making sophisticated glues at least 200,000 years ago. Not just any glues. Complex adhesives that required multi-step chemical processes to create. At sites in South Africa and Europe, archaeologists have found stone tools with residue from birch bark tar still attached. Now, birch bark tar doesn't just appear in nature. You can't squeeze it out of a tree or scrape it off rocks. To make it, you need to heat birch bark to very specific temperatures, between 340 and 400 degrees Celsius in a low oxygen environment. Too much oxygen and it burns. Too little heat and nothing happens. You need to maintain these precise conditions for hours. Think about what that means. Some human 200,000 years ago figured out not just that heating bark could produce glue, but the exact temperature range required, how to create and maintain a low oxygen environment, probably by burying bark in a pit with a carefully controlled fire above it, and how long to maintain the process. Then they had to teach this knowledge to others, passing it down through generations. This isn't trial and error. This is chemistry. Systematic experimentation leading to a reproducible industrial process. And this was just for gluing stone points to wooden shafts. Imagine what other chemical processes they might have discovered and used routinely. processes that left no trace because the products decomposed millennia ago. The implications are staggering. These weren't primitive people stumbling through a harsh world with crude tools. These were sophisticated technologists with deep understanding of materials science. But adhesives are just the beginning. Let's talk about fire. We have solid evidence that Homo erectus, our ancestral species, was using controlled fire at least 400,000 years ago. Some evidence suggests fire use going back 800,000 years or more. Not just using fire when they found it, but creating it on demand, maintaining it, transporting it, using it for specific purposes. The earliest hearths show careful construction. Stones arranged in circles to contain flames. Specific types of wood selected for particular purposes. Some woods burn hot for cooking meat. Others produce less smoke for use inside caves. Still others create coals that stay hot for hours, perfect for keeping a fire alive overnight. Ancient humans knew all this. They were masters of fire chemistry and physics in ways we can barely reconstruct, and they were doing things with fire that seem almost impossible. At sites across Europe, archaeologists have found evidence of what they call fire-cracked rock technology. Ancient humans were heating stones to extreme temperatures, then plunging them into water to make the water boil. Why? Because they wanted to cook foods that would burn over direct flame, or extract fats from bones, or make soups and stews. They were essentially inventing cooking vessels thousands of years before pottery. They didn't have metal pots, so they made the stones themselves into heating elements. That's not primitive. That's ingenious. But here's where it gets really mysterious. How did ancient humans survive in the extreme Arctic? Because they did. We have archaeological sites from northern Siberia dating back 30,000 years or more. These are places where winter temperatures drop to -40 degrees or colder, where the sun doesn't rise for months at a time, where there's no wood for fuel, no plant foods, nothing but ice, snow, and the occasional mammoth. Modern humans would die in these environments within hours without sophisticated cold weather gear. But ancient humans not only survived, they thrived. They raised children in these conditions. They maintained populations for thousands of years. How? The archaeological record shows us their stone tools and some bone needles, suggesting they could sew clothing. But needles aren't enough. You need to know how to prepare animal skins so they remain flexible in extreme cold. You need to understand insulation, layering, moisture management. You need to design clothing that prevents sweating, because sweat kills you at -40. Modern Arctic peoples have this knowledge. They learned it over thousands of years of trial and error, and they preserve it through oral tradition and demonstration. Ancient peoples must have had equivalent knowledge systems, detailed understanding of materials and techniques passed down through generations. But almost none of it survived. We can infer it existed because otherwise the people would have died. But we can't see it, can't study it, can only guess at the sophistication involved. Then there's seafaring. This one should fundamentally change how we think about ancient human capabilities, but somehow it gets glossed over. Australia was colonized at least 65,000 years ago, possibly earlier. This is established fact, confirmed by multiple dating methods across dozens of sites. But here's the thing. Australia was never connected to Asia by a land bridge. Not during the Ice Ages, not ever. To get there, humans had to cross at least 50 miles of open ocean, minimum. Possibly much more depending on which route they took. 50 miles of open ocean isn't something you cross by accident on a log. Ocean currents would sweep you away. Without navigation skills, you'd end up lost at sea. Without provisions, you'd die of thirst. Without a planned expedition, you wouldn't bring breeding populations, men and women, children, enough genetic diversity to establish a viable population on the other side. The colonization of Australia required boats. Not rafts, boats. Vessels capable of carrying multiple people and supplies across open ocean, and it required navigation. The ability to pick a direction and maintain it for hours or days. Possibly the ability to return and make multiple trips. This is sophisticated maritime technology, and the boats themselves left no trace. Wood rots. Plant fibre ropes decay. We have zero direct evidence of what these vessels looked like or how they were constructed, but we know they existed because otherwise there wouldn't be Aboriginal Australians. Somewhere around 65,000 years ago, some group of humans had boat-building technology advanced enough to attempt and succeed in oceanic colonization. Then that technology either disappeared or evolved into forms we can't recognize in the archaeological record. What else disappeared? Let's talk about fiber technology. Plant fibers can be twisted into cordage. Cordage can be woven into nets, baskets, bags, clothing, even structures. In modern hunter-gatherer societies, fiber technology is often more important than stone tools. You use baskets to gather and transport food. You use nets to catch fish and birds. You use bags to carry supplies. You use woven shelters to protect yourself from wind and rain. But plant fibers decompose completely within years in most environments. We have virtually no direct evidence of fiber technology older than about 30,000 years, and even that's rare. Most preservation is from the last 10,000 years. Does this mean ancient humans didn't use fiber technology? Of course not. We have indirect evidence all over the place. Impressions of woven materials in fired clay. Wear patterns on stone tools consistent with cutting plant fibers. Sites located near plants that are excellent for cordage but terrible for food, suggesting they were harvested for fiber. And we have those bone needles from Arctic sites, which imply not just sewing but also the thread to sew with. Ancient humans definitely had fiber technology, probably very sophisticated fiber technology, but almost all of it vanished, leaving us with a completely distorted picture of their capabilities. The same goes for medicine. We know ancient humans understood medicinal plants. How do we know? Because their descendants, modern hunter-gatherers, have incredibly detailed pharmacological knowledge. Australian Aboriginal peoples use hundreds of medicinal plants. Amazon tribes have discovered that combining specific plants creates medicines more effective than either plant alone. This knowledge didn't appear in the last few thousand years. It represents tens of thousands of years of experimentation, observation, and information transfer. Some of this knowledge is preserved in the archaeological record, but only barely. We find Neanderthal skeletons with healed injuries that should have been fatal, broken bones that mended properly, indicating the individual was cared for during months of recovery, dental abscesses that were apparently survived despite the excruciating pain and infection risk. These people had medical knowledge. They understood wound care, probably used plant-based antiseptics, possibly even performed crude surgeries. At one site in France, archaeologists found a Neanderthal skeleton with a healed amputation. This individual had lost a forearm, probably in an accident, and the wound had been treated successfully enough that they survived for years afterward. Think about what that requires. You need to control bleeding, prevent infection, provide enough nutrition for healing, care for someone who can't hunt or gather effectively. This is organized medical care. But we have no direct evidence of the medicines used, the procedures followed, the knowledge systems that made this possible. Then there are the really controversial possibilities, the technologies that might have existed but left so little trace that we can't be sure. Take ceramics. We know pottery appears around 20,000 years ago in China, earlier than anywhere else. But pottery requires you to figure out that certain clays, when heated to high temperatures, become hard and waterproof. Is it possible ancient humans discovered this much earlier but only used ceramics for purposes that don't preserve well or haven't been found yet? Or consider fermentation. Modern hunter-gatherers ferment foods to preserve them, improve digestibility, even create mildly alcoholic beverages. These processes require understanding of microorganisms, temperature control, timing. Did ancient humans ferment foods? Probably. Can we prove it? Almost never, because fermented foods decompose completely. Some researchers have suggested even more radical possibilities. Could ancient humans have understood astronomy well enough to navigate by stars? We have stone arrangements from 10,000 years ago that seem aligned with celestial events, but nothing older. Could they have developed mathematical systems for tracking seasons, animal migrations, resource availability? Modern Aboriginal Australians use complex calendar systems based on ecological observations. Did their ancestors have similar systems 40,000 years ago? We have no way to know. The truth is, every human population that survived into the modern era carried with them knowledge systems developed over hundreds of thousands of years. The San peoples of southern Africa use tracking techniques so sophisticated they can identify individual animals from footprints and determine the animal's health, behavior, even emotional state. This knowledge didn't appear overnight. It represents countless generations of observation and teaching. What other knowledge systems existed in populations that didn't survive? What did the Neanderthals know that died with them? What techniques did ancient populations develop, use for thousands of years, then lose when populations declined or environments changed? We're looking at the past through a tiny keyhole. We see stone tools because stone survives. We see some bone because bone sometimes survives. But everything else, probably 95% or more of ancient human technology and knowledge, it's just gone, decomposed, eroded, lost to time, and that means every confident statement about ancient human capabilities is probably wrong. Not because the evidence we have is bad, but because the evidence we have is desperately incomplete. Those people weren't primitive. They were sophisticated, knowledgeable, technologically innovative. They just used materials that time destroyed. And that changes everything about how we should think about the long dark age before civilization. Maybe it wasn't dark at all. Maybe we're just blind to almost everything that happened. So here's the question that should haunt us. If modern humans have been around for 300,000 years, with brains essentially identical to ours, why did civilization only emerge 12,000 years ago? What took us so long? Think about it. For 288,000 years, roughly 96% of our existence as a species, humans lived without cities, without writing, without agriculture, without any of the things we consider fundamental to civilization. That's not a brief delay. That's almost the entire human story, and the answer isn't that our ancestors were stupid or lazy. The answer is that the world itself was actively hostile to civilization. The primary culprit was climate. Not just bad weather, but systematic, unpredictable. Civilization destroying climate instability that made agriculture nearly impossible for most of human history. During the Pleistocene epoch, which lasted from about 2 6 million years ago until 11,700 years ago, Earth's climate was in constant flux. Not gentle seasonal changes, but massive swings between glacial and interglacial periods that could happen within a human lifetime. Ice cores from Greenland tell us the story. The data shows temperature swings of up to 15 degrees Celsius happening in just decades, sometimes even faster. Rainfall patterns that would shift dramatically and unpredictably. Growing seasons that could shrink from 6 months to 3 months within a generation. This is what climate chaos actually looks like. And it made systematic agriculture virtually impossible. Agriculture requires predictability. You need to know roughly when the rains will come, roughly how long the growing season will last, roughly what temperature ranges to expect. You plant seeds in spring, they grow through summer, you harvest in fall. The system works because the pattern repeats. But during the Pleistocene, patterns didn't repeat. A valley that had reliable rainfall for 50 years might suddenly experience a century of drought. A region with mild winters might abruptly face Arctic conditions. Growing seasons would expand and contract randomly. Any group that committed to agriculture was gambling their survival on climate stability that simply didn't exist. One bad decade and your entire population starves because you've given up the mobile, flexible lifestyle that let you move to where the resources were. Archaeological evidence suggests humans understood this perfectly well. Sites from the late Pleistocene show clear evidence that people were experimenting with proto-agriculture, cultivating wild grains, encouraging useful plants, beginning to control their food sources. But then these experiments would stop. The settlements would be abandoned. People would return to full nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyles. This wasn't failure, this was adaptation. They tried agriculture, the climate betrayed them, and they were smart enough to recognize that mobility was safer than commitment to fixed farming. The hunter-gatherer lifestyle, meanwhile, was actually working remarkably well. This is something we need to understand clearly. Our modern bias assumes that agriculture was an obvious upgrade from hunting and gathering, that civilization represents progress and anything before it was primitive misery. But the archaeological and anthropological evidence tells a very different story. Hunter-gatherers during the Pleistocene, and even into the early Holocene, worked fewer hours than agricultural peoples. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies show they typically work about 15 to 20 hours per week to meet all their food needs. The rest of the time is leisure. Early agriculturalists, by contrast, worked constantly. Clearing land, planting, weeding, harvesting, processing, storing. Agriculture was harder work, not easier. Hunter-gatherers also ate better. Archaeological analysis of human remains shows that pre-agricultural humans were taller, healthier, had better teeth, and lived longer than the early farmers who replaced them. Why? Because hunter-gatherers ate a diverse diet of wild game, fish, nuts, fruits, and vegetables. Agriculturalists ate mostly grain. Lots of calories, but nutritionally monotonous and vulnerable to crop failures. The skeletons don't lie. The transition to agriculture made people smaller, sicker, and created the first epidemic diseases. Hunter-gatherers had population densities too low for epidemic diseases to establish themselves. Early agricultural settlements created the dense, sedentary populations that let diseases spread efficiently. So why would anyone switch? Why abandon a lifestyle that required less work, provided better nutrition, and kept you healthier? The answer is they wouldn't. Not voluntarily, not unless conditions changed so dramatically that the old ways stopped working. But there's another problem that prevented civilization. Population density. Civilization requires specialization. You need farmers who only farm, craftspeople who only make tools, priests who only perform rituals, warriors who only fight, administrators who only organize. But specialization is only possible when you have enough surplus food production to support people who aren't directly producing food. And surplus requires population density. You need enough people in one place that some of them can be spared from subsistence activities. During most of human history, population density was nowhere near the threshold required for specialization. Hunter-gatherer bands typically range from 20 to 50 individuals. At that scale, everyone needs to contribute to survival. You can't have full-time specialists because there aren't enough people to support them. Even when populations grew larger, they tended to split. When a band got too big, it would divide, with part of the group moving to new territory. This kept population density low and prevented the accumulation of specialized roles. You need populations in the thousands concentrated in one place before civilization becomes possible, and achieving that concentration required agricultural surpluses, which required climate stability, which didn't exist during the Pleistocene. It's a catch-22. You can't get civilization without agriculture. You can't sustain agriculture without stable climate. And you can't maintain concentrated populations without agricultural surpluses. The system only works if all the pieces come together simultaneously. But perhaps the most devastating barrier was the information loss problem. Human knowledge is cumulative, but only if it can be transmitted reliably across generations. And for most of human history, that transmission was fragile. Everything humans knew was stored in their brains and passed on through oral tradition. No writing meant no permanent records. No cities meant no schools or formal education systems. No specialization meant no dedicated teachers or scholars. Knowledge survived only if people remembered it and successfully taught it to their children. And that system is vulnerable, catastrophically vulnerable. When people die unexpectedly, their knowledge dies with them. When populations crash during famines or diseases, whole bodies of accumulated knowledge can vanish in a single generation. When groups migrate to new territories, they might abandon knowledge that was specific to their old environment. The archaeological record shows this pattern repeating throughout the Pleistocene. Regional populations developing sophisticated technologies, stone tool traditions showing clear refinement over thousands of years, then suddenly disappearing. Not because better technologies replaced them, but because the knowledge of how to make them was lost. The people who knew died, or the population that carried that knowledge went extinct locally, and the information simply vanished. This is the information bottleneck that prevented technological accumulation. Innovations would emerge, spread through small populations, then disappear when those populations faced catastrophes. Without writing to preserve knowledge independently of human memory, every disaster was also an information disaster. Modern humans experienced this personally when they left Africa 60,000 years ago. Many technologies common in African populations didn't make it to Europe or Asia, not because migrants couldn't have used them, but because the small founding populations didn't include individuals who possessed that specific knowledge. One person knowing how to make sophisticated fishing nets doesn't help if that person drowns before reaching the new territory. The knowledge dies with them, and everyone else has to reinvent it from scratch or go without. Then there's the resource abundance paradox. For much of the Pleistocene, despite all the climate chaos, wild resources were actually quite abundant. The Ice Age world was full of megafauna, massive herds of mammoths, bison, wild horses, giant deer. Plant resources were plentiful if you knew where to look and were willing to move seasonally to harvest them. Under these conditions, there was limited pressure to develop agriculture. Why spend years clearing land, planting seeds, and hoping the climate cooperates when you can just hunt the megafauna that are already everywhere? Why invest in food storage technologies when you can take down a mammoth that provides thousands of pounds of meat? Wild abundance removed the necessity that drives innovation. Humans develop new technologies when existing strategies stop working, not when everything is fine. The evidence suggests humans repeatedly invented proto-agricultural techniques during the Pleistocene, then abandoned them because hunting and gathering remained more reliable and less labor-intensive. Sites in the Middle East show people harvesting wild grains systematically 20,000 years ago, even building permanent structures for grain processing. But these settlements would last a few generations, then be abandoned. People return to mobile hunter-gathering. The same pattern appears in other regions. China shows evidence of rice cultivation experiments dating back 15,000 years that were abandoned. New Guinea has signs of proto-agriculture from 30,000 years ago that didn't develop into full farming until much later. These weren't failures to understand agriculture. These were rational decisions that mobile hunting and gathering remained the superior strategy, given climate instability and resource abundance. But the most devastating barrier to civilization was catastrophic reset events. Every time human populations began accumulating knowledge, developing regional traditions, building toward something more complex, disaster would strike. Climate shifts that turned productive territories into wastelands within decades. Volcanic eruptions that triggered temporary climate crises. Disease outbreaks that crashed populations. Megafloods that destroyed entire river valleys. The archaeological record is filled with these discontinuities. Regional cultures showing clear development over thousands of years, then suddenly disappearing from the record. Not gradually declining, but abruptly ending. What happened? Most likely the populations were destroyed or scattered by environmental catastrophes, and when they were destroyed, so was everything they had built. Not just their settlements, but their accumulated knowledge, their social structures, their technological traditions. This is why civilization took so long. It's not enough to invent agriculture once. You have to invent it and have it succeed, and have that success continue long enough to build stable populations that can develop specialization and knowledge preservation systems. You need decades, preferably centuries, of climate stability so that agriculture proves more reliable than hunting and gathering. You need population growth to create density that allows specialization. You need enough time without catastrophic resets for knowledge to accumulate and technologies to compound. For 288,000 years, humans never got that stability. They would start building toward complexity, and the climate would shift, or a volcano would erupt, or a disease would strike, and everything would collapse. The survivors would retreat to mobile hunter-gathering because that was the only lifestyle, flexible enough to weather constant environmental chaos. Then, 11,700 years ago, something changed. The Ice Age ended. Not gradually, but relatively abruptly in geological terms. Within a few centuries, global temperatures stabilized. Rainfall patterns became predictable. Growing seasons lengthened and standardized. Sea levels stopped fluctuating wildly. For the first time in human history, the climate became stable enough that agriculture was not just possible, but actually advantageous. People in the Fertile Crescent who'd been harvesting wild wheat for thousands of years noticed something new. The growing seasons were consistent now. Year after year, the rains came at roughly the same time. The wild wheat grew predictably, And gradually, probably over many generations, they transitioned from harvesting wild stands to actively cultivating them, planting seeds, weeding out competitors, selecting for desirable traits. Within a few thousand years, multiple human populations independently invented agriculture, not because they suddenly got smarter, but because for the first time the climate allowed it to work reliably. The Fertile Crescent domesticated wheat and barley. China domesticated rice and millet. New Guinea domesticated taro and yams. Mesoamerica domesticated maize and beans. The Andes domesticated potatoes. Each region independently figured out agriculture because suddenly the conditions allowed it to succeed. And once agriculture succeeded, everything else followed. Surplus food allowed population growth. Population growth allowed specialization. Specialization allowed technological accumulation. Technological accumulation allowed further improvements in food production. The feedback loop that had been impossible during the Pleistocene finally began working. Within just a few thousand years after the climate stabilized, civilizations emerged on multiple continents, not because humans changed, but because the world did. The Dark Age before civilization wasn't about human limitation. It was about environmental constraints. For 288,000 years, Earth's climate was systematically hostile to the development of civilization. And the moment those constraints lifted, humans built cities, developed writing, created art and architecture and mathematics and everything else we associate with civilization. We were always capable. We were just waiting for the world to let us prove it. But here's the thing that keeps archaeologists awake at night. Everything we've talked about so far, all these lost civilizations, forgotten technologies, the vast expanse of human prehistory, it's based on an archaeological record that is fundamentally, catastrophically incomplete. We're not talking about missing a few puzzle pieces. We're talking about having maybe 1% of the puzzle and trying to reconstruct the entire picture. Because for hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors lived, loved, built, created, and died without leaving behind anything we can find. And there are very specific reasons why so much disappeared. Why we're essentially blind to 99% of human history. Let's start with the most devastating loss, the drowning of human civilization. Because here's what most people don't realize. During the last ice age, which ended only 11,700 years ago, sea levels were 400 feet lower than they are today. 400 feet. That's a 40-story building worth of difference. And this wasn't just about having more beach. This fundamentally changed where humans could live and where they chose to live. Coastlines are prime real estate for hunter-gatherers. Abundant food from both land and sea. Natural harbours providing protection. Rivers bringing fresh water. Moderate climates without the temperature extremes of the interior. During the Ice Age, what we now think of as continental shelves were dry land. Vast coastal plains stretching for hundreds of miles beyond today's shorelines. And that's where people lived. That's where they built their settlements, developed their technologies, created their cultures. The archaeological evidence we do have supports this overwhelmingly. Virtually every early human settlement we've found near ancient coastlines shows heavy reliance on marine resources. Shell middens piled dozens of feet high, fish bones by the thousands, tools designed specifically for maritime exploitation. When early humans had access to coastlines, they used them intensively, so extrapolate that back 20,000 years, back 50,000 years, back 100,000 years. Where were the majority of humans living? On coastlines that are now underwater. The Persian Gulf was completely dry land during the Ice Age, a vast river valley where the Tigris and Euphrates merged into a single massive river system that flowed through what is now 600 feet of ocean. Archaeological surveys of the Gulf floor using sonar and submarine drones have found what appear to be stone structures, ancient river channels, and possible settlement sites all submerged beneath the water. But we can't excavate them, can't carbon date them, can't study their artifacts or understand their culture. They're gone, drowned when the ice melted and the oceans rose. The same thing happened everywhere. The coastlines of Southeast Asia, now submerged, were once a vast landmass called Sundaland, potentially home to millions of people over tens of thousands of years. The coastal regions of India, where sophisticated maritime cultures probably developed, now lie under hundreds of feet of water. The Mediterranean coast, the Atlantic seaboard, the Pacific Rim, all drowned, all lost, all taking with them the majority of human coastal settlement history. Some researchers estimate that 90% of human population during the Ice Age lived within 20 miles of coastlines. If that's even remotely accurate, then we've lost access to 90% of Ice Age human civilization. Not damaged, not fragmented, completely inaccessible, buried under oceanic sediment and seawater. But it gets worse, because even the inland sites that stayed dry face another devastating problem. Everything rots. Think about what ancient humans made things from: wood, plant fibers, animal skins, bone, shell, feathers, gut, hair. Every single one of these materials biodegrades, and not slowly. Under normal environmental conditions, organic materials start breaking down immediately after they're discarded. Wood can last maybe a few hundred years before it's completely decomposed. Leather and hides, maybe a few decades. Plant fiber baskets and clothing, gone in years. This means that 99% of everything our ancestors made has simply vanished, returned to the soil, consumed by bacteria, fungi, and insects, leaving no trace whatsoever. We find stone tools because stone doesn't rot. We find occasional bones because in very specific conditions, mineral replacement can preserve them. But we don't find the wooden handles those stone tools were attached to. We don't find the leather bags people carried things in. We don't find the plant fiber nets they used for fishing. We don't find the wooden shelters they lived in. We don't find the bark containers they stored food in. All gone, all decomposed, all leaving us with a completely distorted picture of ancient technology. Here's a thought experiment. Imagine archaeologists 50,000 years from now trying to reconstruct our civilization, but every single thing made from plastic, metal, paper, cloth, or any organic material has completely decomposed. All they can find is stuff made from stone and ceramic. What would they think we were like? They'd find stone buildings, ceramic tiles, maybe some glass. They'd completely miss computers, cars, books, clothing, furniture, basically everything that defines modern life. That's the position we're in trying to understand our ancestors. We have the stone tools but not the sophisticated wooden, fiber, and leather technologies that probably represented the majority of their material culture. And occasionally, very occasionally, we get lucky. A site gets waterlogged, creating anaerobic conditions where bacteria can't break down organic material. Or something gets frozen in permafrost, or buried in extremely dry desert conditions. And suddenly we get a glimpse of what we've been missing. The Magdalenian spear throwers from 17,000 years ago, carved from reindeer antler with such artistic skill that they rival anything produced in the Renaissance. The 10,000-year-old baskets from Spirit Cave in Nevada. woven with such sophistication that modern basket makers study them to learn lost techniques. The 5,300-year-old Ötzi the Iceman, whose clothing revealed a technological complexity that completely contradicted our assumptions about Copper Age Europeans. Sophisticated layered garments, waterproof shoes stuffed, with grass for insulation, a copper axe with a carefully designed handle, a backpack frame, a first aid kit containing medicinal plants. This wasn't a primitive savage. This was someone with access to sophisticated technologies that normally never survive. And these are the rare exceptions, the 1 in a million preservation events that show us what we're missing everywhere else. For every Ötzi, there are millions of equally sophisticated individuals whose technologies rotted away without trace. For every preserved basket, there are billions that decomposed. The archaeological record isn't a representative sample of human history. It's a catastrophically biased selection of the tiny fraction of materials that happen to resist decay under unusual conditions. But even this incomplete, biased, fragmentary record faces another devastating filter: population replacement. Because humans don't stay put. We move, we migrate, we conquer, we displace. And when new populations move into a region, they don't preserve the archaeological sites of the people who came before. They build over them, quarry them for building materials, plough them under for agriculture, or simply forget they exist. The archaeological record is littered with examples of cultural discontinuity, places where one population simply vanishes from the record and is replaced by a completely different culture. What happened to the first people? Were they killed? Did they migrate? Did they assimilate? We don't know. Their stories are lost, their languages forgotten, their cultural knowledge gone. The replacement of European hunter-gatherers by Neolithic farmers around 8,000 years ago represents one of the most dramatic population replacements in human history. Genetic analysis shows that the original European hunter-gatherer populations were almost completely replaced by incoming farmers from Anatolia. These farmers didn't just add to the existing population, they largely replaced it. The hunter-gatherers who had lived in Europe for 40,000 years, who had survived the Ice Age, who had created magnificent cave art and sophisticated tools, their genetic contribution to modern Europeans is minimal. Their languages are completely extinct. Their cultural practices mostly forgotten. They're gone, and they took their knowledge with them. 40,000 years of accumulated wisdom about European landscapes, animals, plants, survival strategies, all lost in a few thousand years of population replacement. This same pattern repeated across the globe. In the Americas, successive waves of migration created cultural discontinuities that broke the transmission of knowledge from earlier populations. In East Asia, population expansions and contractions erased entire cultural traditions. In Africa, the expansion of Bantu-speaking peoples over the last 3,000 years displaced or absorbed dozens of earlier populations whose languages and cultures are now extinct. Each discontinuity represents a catastrophic loss of information, knowledge that took thousands of years to accumulate, gone in a generation or two. Because without writing, knowledge exists only in human memory. When the people die or assimilate into new cultures, their knowledge dies with them. But nothing compares to the catastrophe that struck 12,800 years ago, the event that may have erased the most advanced prehistoric civilizations and reset human development across multiple continents. The Younger Dryas Impact Event. Picture this. The Ice Age is ending. For several thousand years, temperatures have been rising steadily. Ice sheets are melting. Sea levels are rising, human populations are expanding, and then suddenly, catastrophically, everything reverses. Around 12,800 years ago, temperatures plunged back to near Ice Age conditions in less than a decade. Not gradually, not over centuries. Within a single human lifespan, the world went from warming to frozen. The Younger Dryas Cold Period, named after an Arctic flower that suddenly appeared in temperate regions as the climate shifted, lasted 1,300 years. From 12,800 to 11,500 years ago, Earth was gripped by a mini ice age that may have been triggered by something truly catastrophic. Increasing evidence suggests that around 12,800 years ago, a comet or asteroid broke apart in the atmosphere over North America and Europe. The fragments created multiple airbursts, similar to the Tunguska event of 1908 but far more widespread. The evidence is controversial but mounting. A layer of platinum, iridium, and other rare elements appears in sediment cores from across the northern hemisphere, dated precisely to 12,800 years ago. These elements are rare on Earth but common in asteroids and comets. Widespread deposits of microscopic diamonds called nanodiamonds, which form only under extreme temperature and pressure, exactly what you'd expect from atmospheric explosions. Burned materials and carbon spherules at the same layer, indicating massive wildfires across multiple continents. Suddenly, extinct megafauna, including mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, and saber-toothed cats, all disappearing right at the beginning of the Younger Dryas, and most tellingly, the near-total collapse of the Clovis culture in North America. The Clovis people were the most successful Paleo-Indian culture of their time, spread across North America with sophisticated stone tool technology. Then suddenly, right at 12,800 years ago, their distinctive artifacts vanish from the archaeological record. The culture that had dominated a continent simply disappeared. What happened? If the impact hypothesis is correct, and it's still debated, then the Clovis people and their contemporaries across the northern hemisphere witnessed an apocalypse, multiple airbursts, creating firestorms across thousands of square miles, ash and debris blocking the sun, causing rapid temperature drops, collapse of food chains as plants died and animals starved, destruction of coastal settlements by tsunamis generated from ice sheet collapse, and then 1,300 years of brutal cold that made survival in many previously habitable regions impossible. If sophisticated cultures existed 13,000 years ago, cultures that had spent millennia accumulating knowledge and developing technologies, they were erased, not just damaged, not just set back, completely destroyed. The survivors, scattered and traumatized, would have had to start over. And starting over means losing the accumulated knowledge of the previous era. The sophisticated astronomical observations, lost. The advanced building techniques, forgotten. The navigational knowledge, gone. The survivors were too busy staying alive to preserve scholarly knowledge. Within a generation or two, the accomplishments of the pre-impact civilization would have become myths and legends, if they were remembered at all. And here's the truly frustrating part. Even with modern technology, we've barely scratched the surface of what might still be found. Archaeologists estimate that less than 1% of potential archaeological sites have been excavated. 1%. Think about that. We're reconstructing hundreds of thousands of years of human history based on 1% of the available evidence. And that's not because archaeologists are lazy. It's because the world is huge. Archaeological excavation is slow, expensive, and requires extensive expertise. A single site can take decades to properly excavate and analyze. and there are millions of potential sites across every continent, most of which we haven't even identified yet, let alone excavated. Every year, construction projects accidentally uncover new sites that completely change our understanding of regional prehistory. A subway expansion in Istanbul reveals a massive Neolithic settlement. A highway project in Israel uncovers 9,000-year-old ceremonial structures. Coastal erosion in Alaska exposes Ice Age hunting camps. Each discovery adds tiny fragments to our understanding, but for every site we find, thousands more remain buried and undiscovered. Or worse, are being destroyed before we even know they exist. Urban development, agriculture, erosion, all constantly destroying archaeological sites. In many parts of the world, ancient settlements are being bulldozed for shopping malls and apartment complexes. Coastal sites are eroding into the ocean due to sea level rise and storm damage. Agricultural expansion is ploughing under ancient villages. We're in a race against time, trying to document and study sites before they disappear forever, and we're losing. But perhaps the greatest loss of all isn't material, it's informational. For hundreds of thousands of years, human knowledge was transmitted orally. Stories, songs, poems, all carrying practical information about survival, natural resources, sacred places, historical events. This oral tradition was sophisticated and extensive. Modern studies of remaining oral cultures show they can accurately preserve complex information for dozens of generations. Aboriginal Australians have oral traditions describing geological events that occurred over 10,000 years ago, confirmed by modern scientific dating. Polynesian navigators memorized charts of currents, stars, and islands that allowed them to navigate thousands of miles of open ocean without instruments. Celtic bards memorized epic poems tens of thousands of lines long, preserving tribal history and genealogy. But without writing, all this knowledge is vulnerable. A single catastrophe that kills the knowledge keepers can erase thousands of years of accumulated wisdom. A cultural replacement that disrupts the transmission of oral tradition can break the chain of memory permanently. And that's what happened over and over again throughout prehistory. How many origin stories are lost? How many epic tales of prehistoric heroes? How many detailed accounts of ancient migrations, wars, alliances, and achievements? All gone, all forgotten, all leaving us with nothing but silent artifacts and ambiguous ruins. We know ancient humans were capable of sophisticated abstract thought because we find their art. We know they were capable of complex planning because we find their megalithic structures. We know they had rich cultural lives because we find their burial sites with grave goods. But we don't know their stories. We don't know what they believed about the world. We don't know what they dreamed about, feared, or hoped for. That entire dimension of human experience is lost to us, perhaps forever. Yet, in recent years, a few extraordinary discoveries have given us glimpses of what lies beneath the waves. In 2001, marine archaeologists discovered what appeared to be massive stone structures off the coast of Gujarat, India, submerged under 120 feet of water. Sonar imaging revealed geometric patterns, what looked like foundations, and extensive stonework covering several square miles. The structures would have been above water 9,500 years ago. In the Mediterranean, underwater surveys have found dozens of prehistoric settlements now submerged, showing sophisticated construction techniques including stone foundations, defensive walls, and organized layouts. Off the coast of Japan, the controversial Yonaguni Monument remains a mystery. A massive stone structure with apparently carved steps channels and geometric shapes lying 100 feet underwater. Natural formation or human-made structure? The debate continues, but the possibility that it represents a 10,000-year-old construction is tantalizing. These underwater finds represent a fraction of what must exist on now submerged coastlines around the world. The technology to properly survey and excavate underwater sites is still developing. Most of the continental shelf remains unsurveyed, unknown, holding secrets that could revolutionize our understanding of human prehistory. Because here's what we're beginning to realize. The story we've told ourselves about human history, the simple narrative of primitive hunter-gatherers gradually developing civilization, it might be fundamentally wrong. Not because our ancestors were more advanced than we thought, though they might have been, but because we're missing most of the story. The Great Forgetting wasn't a single event. It was a continuous process. Rising seas drowning coastal settlements, organic materials decomposing, population replacements erasing cultural memory, catastrophic climate events destroying accumulated knowledge, oral traditions breaking down as languages went extinct, and the simple passage of time grinding everything to dust. We're like detectives trying to solve a case where 99% of the evidence has been destroyed. The few clues we have are fragmentary, biased, and often misleading. And yet, from these scattered fragments, we're trying to reconstruct the lives, achievements, and failures of hundreds of billions of people across hundreds of thousands of years. It's an impossible task. But it's also the only task we have, because understanding where we came from, understanding the long dark ages before civilization arose, that's essential to understanding who we are. We are the descendants of people who survived every catastrophe the world could throw at them, who rebuilt after every disaster, who preserved what knowledge they could and reinvented what they couldn't. Their story is our story, and even though most of it is lost, what remains is enough to tell us something profound. Humanity has risen before, and fallen, and risen again. The Dark Age before civilization wasn't darkness in the sense of ignorance or primitivism, it was darkness in the sense of mystery, a vast expanse of time where human beings lived complex lives, developed sophisticated cultures and accomplished things we can barely imagine. But they did it without leaving records we can read, and so they vanished into the forgetting, leaving us to wonder what we've lost. Now we need to talk about the theories that make professional archaeologists throw things at their screens. Because here's the thing about a dark age lasting 290,000 years. It creates a lot of room for speculation. When you have modern humans with brains functionally identical to ours wandering around for hundreds of thousands of years, apparently doing not much of anything, people start asking questions, uncomfortable questions, questions that challenge the conventional narrative of slow, steady progress from primitive savagery to civilization. And some of those questions, to be honest, are worth asking. But others, well, let's just say they require believing things that the physical evidence doesn't really support. So let's wade into the controversial stuff, the alternative timelines, the fringe theories, the claims that make mainstream archaeologists roll their eyes so hard they risk permanent damage. And let's try to separate the genuinely intriguing mysteries from the complete nonsense. We'll start with one of the oldest and weirdest theories about human evolution, the aquatic ape hypothesis. This idea, first proposed in the 1960s, suggests that somewhere between 8 and 4 million years ago our ancestors went through an aquatic or semi-aquatic phase. That for some period of time early humans lived primarily in and around water, wading in shallow coastal environments, diving for shellfish, maybe even swimming in the open ocean. The theory tries to explain some genuinely odd features of human anatomy. Why are we basically hairless compared to other apes? Because we evolved in water, and fur is a disadvantage for aquatic mammals. Why do we have a layer of subcutaneous fat like seals and dolphins? Aquatic adaptation. Why can we hold our breath so much longer than other primates? Why do human babies instinctively hold their breath when submerged? Why do we walk upright when it's so biomechanically awkward on land? All aquatic adaptations, according to the hypothesis. And look, some of these observations are interesting. Humans are weird primates. We have traits that don't fit neatly into the standard savanna adaptation model. But here's the problem with the aquatic ape hypothesis. It requires us to ignore basically the entire fossil record. We have thousands of early human fossils, Australopithecus, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, all the transitional forms between ape-like ancestors and modern humans, and none of them, not one, shows adaptations for aquatic life. No flipper-like hands, no streamlined body shapes, no modifications to the inner ear for underwater balance, no changes to bone density that would help with diving. What the fossils do show is exactly what you'd expect from terrestrial primates, gradually adapting to life on the African savanna. Longer legs for walking, hands modified for tool use, changes to the pelvis for upright locomotion. Everything points to life on land, not in water. The aquatic ape hypothesis survives because it sounds intriguing and explains some superficially odd features, but it doesn't survive contact with the actual evidence. Most mainstream anthropologists don't even bother arguing against it anymore. It's just not worth the time. But at least the aquatic ape theory is about the distant past, millions of years ago. Things get really wild when we start talking about the more recent past. The period we're actually discussing in this documentary, the last few 100,000 years of human history, because this is where we get claims of advanced Ice Age civilizations, lost continents, ancient high technology, sophisticated astronomical knowledge that supposedly shouldn't have existed. The most famous proponent of these ideas is probably Graham Hancock, whose books have sold millions of copies and whose Netflix series brought alternative prehistory to a massive new audience. Hancock argues that during the last Ice Age, roughly 12,000 to 100,000 years ago, there existed an advanced civilization, not as technologically sophisticated as ours, but far more advanced than the hunter-gatherer societies that archaeology tells us existed. This civilization, according to Hancock, had advanced knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, and engineering. They built sophisticated structures, developed ocean-going ships, and created accurate maps of the world. Then, around 12,000 years ago, they was destroyed by a global catastrophe. Maybe a comet impact, maybe a massive flood, maybe both. The survivors of this civilization scattered across the world, bringing their knowledge to primitive hunter-gatherer societies. They became the culture heroes of ancient mythology, the wise men who taught agriculture, astronomy, and architecture to ignorant savages. Thoth in Egypt, Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerica, Viracocha in South America, and the monuments they inspired, the pyramids, the megalithic temples, the geometrically aligned stone circles, these are remnants of this lost civilization's knowledge, echoes of a forgotten golden age. It's a compelling narrative. It explains some genuinely puzzling features of ancient monuments, and it appeals to something deep in human psychology, the sense that we've lost something important, that our ancestors knew things we've forgotten. But here's the problem. It doesn't fit the evidence. Let's take one specific example, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. This is a genuine archaeological sensation, a massive stone temple complex built around 11,000 years ago, supposedly by hunter-gatherers who didn't even have agriculture yet. The stones weigh up to 16 tons. They're carved with sophisticated reliefs of animals and abstract symbols. The site required thousands of hours of coordinated labor. Alternative historians point to Göbekli Tepe as evidence that hunter-gatherers couldn't possibly have been as primitive as mainstream archaeology claims. They argue it must have been built with knowledge inherited from an earlier, more advanced civilization. But archaeologists working at the site found something interesting. They found the quarries where the stones were cut. They found the tools used to carve them. Simple stone implements, exactly the kind that hunter-gatherers would have used. They found the remains of the feast sites where workers were fed. Wild game and gathered plants, no evidence of domesticated species. Most tellingly, they found evidence of the learning process. Earlier structures at Göbekli Tepe are cruder, less sophisticated. Later ones show increasing refinement and skill. This is exactly what you'd expect if the builders were developing their techniques through trial and error, not if they were working from inherited plans from an advanced civilization. Göbekli Tepe is amazing. It pushes back our understanding of what organized human societies were capable of. But it doesn't require lost civilizations to explain. It requires us to give Stone Age humans more credit than we usually do. The same pattern appears with other supposedly anomalous sites. The Great Pyramid of Giza. Yes, it's incredibly precisely aligned to cardinal directions. Yes, its dimensions encode mathematical relationships. But we also have extensive evidence of how it was built. Quarry marks, tool marks, worker villages, accounting records on papyrus. No advanced lost technology required. Just thousands of skilled workers using copper tools and a lot of patience. But what about those astronomical alignments? This is where things get genuinely interesting. Because the truth is, many Paleolithic and Neolithic sites do show sophisticated astronomical knowledge. Stonehenge aligns with solstices. Newgrange in Ireland has a passage that's illuminated only on the winter solstice. Sites across Europe show alignments with star risings and lunar cycles. And this stuff is old. Really old. Newgrange dates to around 3200 BCE. That's older than the pyramids. Some stone circles in Britain might be even older, possibly dating back 5,000 years or more. So what's going on? Did Stone Age people have advanced astronomical knowledge or not? The answer is yes, but we need to be careful about what we mean by advanced. Ancient people definitely paid close attention to the sky. They tracked the movements of the sun, moon, and stars. They recognized patterns and cycles. They used this knowledge for practical purposes, timing seasonal migrations, predicting the best times to hunt or gather, creating calendars for ritual events. And they encoded this knowledge in their monuments. Stones aligned with solstice sunrises, passage tombs designed to be illuminated on specific days, circles of stones that track lunar cycles. This is sophisticated. It requires careful observation over many generations. It requires mathematical thinking to predict celestial events. It requires engineering skill to create alignments that remain accurate over centuries. But it doesn't require advanced technology or lost civilizations. It just requires intelligent people who paid attention to the world around them and had reasons to track celestial cycles. The danger comes when we start seeing astronomical alignments everywhere, even where they probably don't exist. When we notice that 3 sites form a triangle and assume it must be intentional. When we measure the dimensions of ancient structures and find they can be expressed as ratios of pi or phi, and assume this must represent advanced mathematical knowledge rather than, basic geometry. This is confirmation bias in action. When you're looking for evidence of lost knowledge, you'll find it, even in random data, especially in fragmentary archaeological records where so much is missing or uncertain. Then there are the anomalous artifacts, the out-of-place objects that supposedly shouldn't exist according to conventional chronology. The Baghdad battery, a clay jar that some claim is a 2,000-year-old electrical cell. Except it probably isn't. It's probably just a storage vessel, and when archaeologists try to replicate it as a battery, they get almost no electrical output. The Antikythera mechanism, an ancient Greek device with complex gearing that could predict astronomical positions. This one is actually real and genuinely sophisticated, but it's from around 100 BCE, well within the period of known advanced Greek science and mathematics. It's remarkable, but it doesn't require lost civilizations. It just requires us to acknowledge that ancient Greeks were really, really good at math and engineering. The Piri-Reis map, a 16th century Turkish map that supposedly shows Antarctica before it was ice-covered, suggesting knowledge from an ancient pre-Ice Age civilization. Except it doesn't actually show Antarctica accurately. It shows a confused coastline that could be misinterpreted as Antarctica if you squint really hard and ignore most of the details. Pattern after pattern, artifact after artifact. Things that seem mysterious until you examine them carefully, and then they turn out to have mundane explanations. But there is one controversial theory that has more scientific support than mainstream archaeology wants to admit. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. About 12,800 years ago, the Earth was emerging from the last ice age. Global temperatures were rising, ice sheets were melting, human populations were expanding, then suddenly, dramatically, temperatures plunged. Within decades, the world was thrown back into near-glacial conditions. This period lasted about 1,200 years and is called the Younger Dryas. For decades, scientists assumed this was just a natural fluctuation in climate patterns, maybe changes in ocean currents, maybe volcanic eruptions, random climate variability. But in the early 2000s, researchers started finding something weird. A thin layer of sediment dating to the start of the Younger Dryas that contains unusual materials, nanodiamonds, which form under extreme temperatures and pressures, iridium, which is rare on Earth but common in asteroids, microscopic spherules of melted rock, carbon spherules from massive fires, platinum anomalies. This is the signature of an impact event, a comet or asteroid breaking up in the atmosphere and detonating over North America, Europe, and possibly other regions. The evidence suggests this wasn't a single large impact like the one that killed the dinosaurs. It was an airburst or series of airbursts from a fragmenting comet. The effects would have been catastrophic. Massive fires across entire continents, rapid climate changes from the debris thrown into the atmosphere, possible collapse of megafauna populations that were already stressed from climate change, and potentially the destruction of human settlements and populations. Some researchers argue this impact event might explain some of the mysteries of the period. Why so many large animal species went extinct around this time, why human population genetics show evidence of bottlenecks, why certain cultural traditions seem to have been disrupted. The hypothesis remains controversial. Not all geologists accept the impact evidence. Alternative explanations for the climate change exist, but the evidence keeps accumulating. More sites with the impact layer, more chemical signatures that are hard to explain without an impact. This is how science is supposed to work. A controversial idea is proposed, evidence accumulates, debate continues. Eventually, either the theory gains acceptance or it's definitively disproven. But here's why mainstream archaeology rejects most alternative history claims, not because of some conspiracy to hide the truth, not because academics are closed-minded, but because extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If you want to claim an advanced Ice Age civilization existed, you need to show me their cities, their tools, their trash heaps. Civilizations leave enormous amounts of material evidence. Even after thousands of years, even after catastrophes, something survives. We have evidence of every other human culture that's existed. Why would this one be completely invisible? If you want to claim ancient people had advanced technology, you need to show me the technology, or at least evidence it existed. Tool marks that can only be explained by advanced cutting tools, materials that couldn't have been worked with Stone Age technology, chemical residues from advanced metallurgy. If you want to claim ancient maps show knowledge that shouldn't have existed, you need to demonstrate that the maps are actually accurate, not just vaguely similar to modern coastlines if you ignore all the wrong parts. The burden of proof is on the people making the claims, and we can't explain this with current knowledge is not the same as therefore lost civilizations. Because the truth is there's a lot we don't know about prehistory, vast amounts. The archaeological record is fragmentary. Most human activity leaves no trace. Organic materials decay, stone structures erode, coastlines change, sea levels rise and fall. We're looking at a broken, incomplete picture and trying to reconstruct what happened. It's hard, and it's easy to fill in the gaps with speculation, but speculation isn't evidence. Interesting questions aren't proof, and the desire for mysteries to have exotic explanations doesn't make those explanations true. So what genuine mysteries remain? Plenty, actually. We still don't fully understand how Paleolithic people achieved some of their artistic accomplishments. The cave paintings at Chauvet, created 36,000 years ago, show sophisticated use of perspective, shading and composition. How did they develop these techniques? Did earlier, now lost traditions exist? We don't know why humans suddenly started burying their dead with grave goods around 100,000 years ago. What changed in human cognition or culture that made this important? We can't explain the sudden explosion of symbolic behavior around 40,000 years ago. Cave art, personal ornaments, musical instruments, all appearing in the archaeological record within a relatively short time. Why then? What triggered this creative revolution? We don't fully understand how Neolithic people transported and erected massive stones without metal tools or wheels. We have theories, lots of them, but the exact techniques remain uncertain. These are real mysteries, ones that mainstream archaeology acknowledges and is actively working to solve. The difference between real scientific mysteries and fringe alternative theories is simple. Real mysteries are based on solid evidence that we don't yet fully understand. Fringe theories are based on interpreting ambiguous evidence in the most exotic way possible, while ignoring simpler explanations. Science progresses by solving mysteries, not by inventing new ones. But the appetite for alternative histories tells us something important about human psychology. We want our ancestors to have been more than we imagine. We want to believe they possessed wisdom we've lost. We're uncomfortable with the idea that civilization is a recent fragile achievement that could have gone differently or not happened at all. Maybe the truth is both humbler and more inspiring than lost civilizations. Our ancestors were just people, smart, creative, adaptive people. They didn't have advanced technology. They didn't inherit knowledge from earlier civilizations. They figured things out themselves, slowly, through trial and error, through careful observation of nature, through tens of thousands of years of accumulated experience, and eventually, finally, they created us. That's the real miracle. Not that some lost civilization gave them knowledge, but that they developed it themselves from nothing, starting with stone tools and fire and building generation by generation towards something unprecedented. The dark age before civilization wasn't dark because knowledge was lost. It was dark because knowledge was still being created, slowly, painfully, with countless dead ends and failures. And when it finally ended, when civilization finally emerged, it wasn't because someone remembered ancient secrets. It was because after 290,000 years of trying, humans finally figured it out. Around 10,000 BCE, something happened that had never happened before in the entire history of our species. After 290,000 years of wandering, hunting, gathering, and surviving, humans stopped moving. Now, this might not sound revolutionary, but think about what it actually means. For nearly 300,000 years, every single human who had ever lived was essentially nomadic. They moved with the seasons, followed animal migrations, relocated when resources ran out. The idea of staying in one place for your entire life, of building a permanent home that your children and grandchildren would also live in, that concept simply didn't exist. Then, in a tiny sliver of land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a group of hunter-gatherers did something that would change everything. They planted seeds, not just scattering them randomly like they'd probably done thousands of times before, but deliberately, systematically, with the intention of staying put long enough to harvest what they'd planted. This was the beginning of the Neolithic Revolution, and the wild thing is, nobody planned it. There was no ancient genius who suddenly invented agriculture and convinced everyone to settle down. It emerged gradually, almost accidentally, because for the first time in over 100,000 years, the climate had become stable enough to make it possible. See, here's what most people don't realize. Those 290,000 years of hunter-gatherer existence weren't just humanity being slow to figure things out. They were 290,000 years of climate chaos making permanent settlement effectively impossible. The Ice Age world was violently unstable. Temperatures could shift dramatically within a single human lifetime. Rainfall patterns were unpredictable. Rivers changed course. Lakes appeared and disappeared. Forests turned to grasslands and back again. If you tried to settle down and grow crops in that environment, you'd starve. One year the rains wouldn't come. The next year they'd come too much and flood everything. The wild animals you depended on would migrate away and not return. Your permanent village would become a death trap. So humans stayed mobile, not because they were primitive, but because mobility was the only rational survival strategy in an unstable world. Then, around 11,700 years ago, everything changed. The last ice age ended, and Earth entered what geologists call the Holocene epoch. But this wasn't just another climate shift. The Holocene was different. It was stable. Year after year, decade after decade, century after century, the climate patterns became predictable. The monsoons arrived on schedule, rivers flowed consistently, growing seasons became reliable. For the first time in human history, you could plant seeds in the spring and be reasonably confident you'd be able to harvest them in the fall. Not just this year, but next year, and the year after that. This stability created a window of opportunity, and humans, those descendants of bottleneck survivors who'd been refined by 117,000 years of crisis and 290,000 years of adaptation, They recognized it and seized it immediately. In the Fertile Crescent, that arc of land stretching from modern-day Iraq through Syria and down to Israel, small groups of hunter-gatherers began experimenting with wild grains. Emmer wheat, einkorn wheat, barley. These plants grew naturally in the region, and people had been harvesting them opportunistically for thousands of years. But now they started noticing patterns. The seeds that fell near their campsites would sprout the next year. The areas they cleared for temporary shelters would produce denser grain growth. Within just a few hundred years, they went from casually collecting wild plants to deliberately planting and tending them. They learned to select seeds from the best plants, creating the first domesticated crops. They built permanent structures to store their harvests. They constructed the first granaries, the first evidence of humans planning not just days or weeks ahead, but months and years. And here's where it gets really wild. The transition from first agriculture to actual cities happened shockingly fast. In evolutionary terms, it was basically instantaneous. Around 9,600 BCE, just 400 years after agriculture began, humans built Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey. This wasn't a village. This was a massive ceremonial complex with carved stone pillars weighing up to 20 tons, decorated with sophisticated artwork depicting animals and abstract symbols. This means that within just a few generations of settling down, humans had developed the social organization, architectural knowledge, and engineering skills to create monumental architecture. They'd gone from sleeping in temporary shelters to building structures that still stand 11,000 years later. By 7,400 BCE, Çatalhöyük had emerged in central Turkey. This was a genuine city, home to perhaps 8,000 people, living in densely packed mud brick houses. They had art, religion, long-distance trade networks bringing obsidian from hundreds of miles away. They had specialized craftspeople, social hierarchies, all the hallmarks of complex civilization, 3,000 years from first agriculture to cities. After 290,000 years of hunting and gathering, humans assembled civilization in less time than has passed since the invention of writing. But here's what's truly mind-blowing. This wasn't a unique event that spread from one location. Agriculture was invented independently at least 7 different times, in 7 completely isolated regions around the world, all within a few thousand years of each other. In China around 9,000 BCE, people along the Yellow River began cultivating millet and rice. They had no contact with Middle Eastern farmers. They developed completely different crops using completely different techniques. But they made the same conceptual leap from gathering wild plants to deliberately planting and tending them. In Mesoamerica around 8,000 BCE, people were domesticating squash, beans, and eventually maize, completely independently, using plants that didn't exist in the Old World, creating agricultural systems based on entirely different environmental conditions. In New Guinea, around 7,000 BCE, people began cultivating bananas, taro, and yams. In the Sahel region of Africa around 5,000 BCE, sorghum and African rice. In the eastern United States around 4,000 BCE, sunflowers and goosefoot. In the Andes around 3,000 BCE, potatoes and quinoa. 7 separate agricultural revolutions. 7 independent discoveries that settling down and growing food was possible and advantageous, all happening within a 6,000-year window after the climate stabilized. This can't be coincidence. This tells us something profound about what had prevented civilization from emerging earlier. It wasn't that humans weren't smart enough or socially developed enough. Our ancestors 50,000 years ago had the same brains we do. They were just as intelligent, just as innovative, just as capable of abstract reasoning. What they didn't have was a stable climate. The moment Earth's climate stabilized, humans all over the world with no contact between them immediately figured out agriculture and started building civilizations. The capability had always been there, only the opportunity was missing. And once that opportunity arrived, the changes accelerated beyond anything the world had ever seen. Because agriculture did something unprecedented, it created food surplus. For the first time in human history, a single family could produce more food than it needed to survive. That surplus changed everything. First, it allowed population growth on a scale that was previously impossible. Hunter-gatherer populations are naturally limited by available resources. You can only have as many people as the land can support through hunting and gathering. That ceiling is pretty low, maybe one person per square mile in rich environments, much less in marginal ones. But agricultural populations aren't limited the same way. 1 acre of wheat can feed far more people than 1 acre of wild game and plants. Suddenly, human populations exploded. By 5000 BCE, just 5,000 years after agriculture began, the global human population had increased from maybe 5 million to over 50 million. Within another 3,000 years, it would reach 100 million. But population growth alone doesn't create civilization. What really mattered was what humans did with that food surplus. Because when you can produce more food than you need to eat, you can support people who don't grow food at all. You can have specialists. Some people became full-time craftspeople, developing skills far beyond what anyone could achieve, while also spending most of their time finding food. They became expert potters, weavers, metalworkers. Their products improved dramatically, and that improvement accelerated as knowledge was passed down and refined across generations. Other people became traders, moving goods between regions and creating economic networks that spanned hundreds or thousands of miles. Obsidian from Turkey shows up in sites across the Middle East. Jade from China appears in Southeast Asian archaeological sites. Copper from the Great Lakes region reaches communities across eastern North America. Still others became full-time administrators, managers who organized the collective labor needed for large construction projects, irrigation systems and defense. And yes, warriors. Because once you've stored food surplus, you have something worth stealing. Agricultural societies needed protection from raiders, both nomadic groups who never settled down and neighboring agricultural communities competing for the same resources. This created what anthropologists call social stratification. Hunter-gatherer societies tend to be relatively egalitarian. Sure, some individuals have more prestige than others, better hunters or more skilled healers. But there's a limit to how much inequality can exist when everyone is mobile and nobody can accumulate much property. Agricultural societies are different. Some families have better land. Some are more skilled farmers. Some get lucky with harvests while others suffer crop failures. Over generations, these small differences compound. Wealth accumulates. Power concentrates. Hierarchies emerge. By 4000 BCE, the first true kingdoms were forming in Mesopotamia. These weren't just large villages. They were complex political entities with rulers, bureaucracies, standing armies, and tribute systems. Common people worked the fields and paid taxes in grain and labor. Elite classes controlled the surplus, using it to support craft specialists, soldiers, priests, and themselves. Was this good or bad? That's the wrong question. It was inevitable. Once you create food surplus and permanent settlements, hierarchy follows automatically. The people who control the surplus control everything else. Within a few generations of settling down, humans went from living in small egalitarian bands where everyone had roughly equal status to living in kingdoms with god-kings who commanded thousands of subjects. But the most important innovation of early civilization wasn't social hierarchy, or monumental architecture, or even agriculture itself. It was writing. Because writing solved a problem that had plagued humanity since the beginning. How do you preserve knowledge across generations? Oral tradition works, but it's limited. You can memorize songs and stories, pass them down through teaching and repetition. But there's a ceiling to how much information a human brain can hold and accurately transmit. Complex information gets simplified. Details get lost. After a few generations, the original knowledge becomes distorted or disappears entirely. Writing changed this completely. Around 3400 BCE in Mesopotamia, administrators keeping track of grain stores and trade goods developed the first written symbols. These weren't meant to be literature. They were accounting records, tallies of how much barley was in which storehouse, records of who owed what to whom. But within a few hundred years, writing expanded to encompass everything: laws, religious texts, historical records, astronomical observations, medical knowledge, mathematical calculations, poetry, mythology. For the first time, human knowledge could accumulate indefinitely. Each generation could build on what the previous generation had discovered without relying on memory alone. This created a ratchet effect. Progress could only go forward. Knowledge, once written down, couldn't be completely lost unless all copies were destroyed. Libraries became repositories of accumulated human understanding spanning centuries. Within 1,500 years of inventing writing, humans had developed mathematics sophisticated enough to predict eclipses, engineering advanced enough to build pyramids, medical knowledge detailed enough to perform surgery, and philosophical systems still studied today. All because information could finally persist and compound across generations. And just like agriculture, writing was invented independently multiple times. Mesopotamian cuneiform around 3400 BCE, Egyptian hieroglyphics around 3200 BCE, Chinese characters around 1200 BCE, Mesoamerican systems around 900 BCE, each completely independent, each solving the same problem in different ways. This tells us something crucial. The capability for civilization had always existed in humans. The intelligence, the creativity, the social skills, all of it was there 50,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, maybe even further back. What was missing wasn't human potential. What was missing were the environmental conditions that made civilization possible and the accumulated knowledge that writing finally allowed. The so-called Dark Age before civilization wasn't dark because our ancestors were primitive. It was dark because they were living in an unstable world that made permanent settlement impossible, and even their most brilliant innovations died with the generation that created them, unable to accumulate and compound the way written knowledge does. When the climate stabilized, when the Holocene began, humans didn't slowly develop civilization over tens of thousands of years. They exploded into it almost immediately. From first agriculture to cities in 3,000 years, from cities to empires in another 5,000, from empires to global civilizations in 5,000 more. After 290,000 years of seeming stasis, human civilization assembled itself in less than 10,000 years. Not because we suddenly became smarter or more capable, but because for the first time the world allowed us to stay in one place long enough to build something permanent. And once we started building, we never stopped. The Dark Age had finally ended, not because the darkness lifted, but because we finally had stable enough ground to light a fire that wouldn't go out, and that fire, once lit, would illuminate everything that came after. So here we are, at the end of this journey through the darkest chapters of human history, and I want you to sit with something for a moment, something truly humbling. 95% of human existence is just gone. Not forgotten, but never recorded in the first place. 300,000 years of modern humans, and we can only reconstruct the tiniest fraction of their experiences. The remaining 95% is a void, an absence, a darkness so complete we can barely conceive of it. Think about what that means. For every story we know, there are 100,000 we don't. For every innovation we've discovered in the archaeological record, there were probably dozens that left no trace. For every person whose remains we've found and studied, there were millions who lived, loved, struggled, and died without leaving a single artifact behind. But here's the thing, that darkness, that vast unexplored ocean of human experience, it's not empty. It was filled with people just like us. Same brains, same cognitive abilities, same capacity for joy and suffering and wonder. A human from 100,000 years ago could walk into your life today, give them a few years to catch up on technology and culture, and you'd never know the difference. They weren't primitive. They weren't simple. They were us, just living in a different world with different challenges, and they survived. That's the real lesson of the Dark Age before civilization. They survived everything. Climate disasters that killed 98% of their population, ice ages that locked up half the planet's water, droughts that lasted generations, volcanic winters that blotted out the sun. And they didn't just survive, they thrived. They spread across every continent except Antarctica. They adapted to deserts, rainforests, tundra, mountains. They learned to hunt everything from mammoths to rabbits, to gather everything from acorns to shellfish. The people who lived through those 300,000 years of darkness developed every fundamental human survival skill. Fire management, tool making, shelter building, social cooperation, language, art, ritual. Everything that makes us human was refined during those lost millennia. We're not smarter than they were. We just have more information accumulated over more generations. But that brings us to something crucial, something this whole journey has been building toward. Civilization is fragile, terrifyingly fragile. Our ancestors had knowledge that took thousands of years to accumulate, skills passed down generation after generation, technologies that represented the accumulated wisdom of entire lineages, and it could all disappear in a single generation if something disrupted the chain of transmission. A disease that killed the elders before they could teach the young. A climate disaster that scattered groups too widely to maintain contact. A war that destroyed a community's cultural memory. This happened over and over during the Dark Age. Knowledge was gained and lost and gained again. Technologies were invented, forgotten, and reinvented by people who had no idea their great-great-great-grandparents had solved the same problem 1,000 years earlier. The archaeological record shows this pattern everywhere. Sophistication followed by simplification, innovation followed by abandonment. It's the signature of cultures rising and falling, of knowledge slipping through humanity's fingers like water. We live in a different world now. For the first time in human history, we can preserve information beyond the fragile medium of human memory. Everything you're watching right now, this video, these words, this knowledge, it can outlast me, outlast you, potentially outlast our entire generation. That's unprecedented, that's revolutionary, and it's something we should be deeply grateful for, because it means the next dark age, if it comes, doesn't have to be as dark. The knowledge we're accumulating now can survive catastrophes that would have erased entire civilizations in the past, but only if we continue to preserve it, share it, build systems that can outlast individual humans and individual societies. And that brings me to you. If this journey through humanity's lost millennia has meant something to you, if it's changed how you think about our species and our history, then help preserve and share this knowledge. Hit that like button so more people can find this video. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Add your voice to this global conversation about our shared past. And subscribe to this channel because we're going to keep diving deep into the forgotten corners of human history, keep exploring the stories that shaped us, keep asking the questions that matter. Because somewhere out there in that vast darkness of the prehistoric past, your ancestors survived impossible odds to give you this moment. They endured the bottleneck, they weathered the ice ages, they kept the fire burning through the longest night in human history. They never knew their names would be forgotten, that their stories would dissolve into the archaeological record like footprints in ancient sand. But they lived, they mattered, and they made you possible. That's worth remembering, that's worth preserving, that's worth sharing. The Dark Age before civilization lasted 300,000 years. Let's make sure the Age of Knowledge lasts even longer,